Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Aparna Vatve, Faculty of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This module is Pastoralism as a Natural Resource Management Practice. It is part of the paper Environment and Society. In this module, I will introduce pastoralism, the types of pastoralism that are seen in India, different types of pastoral communities and the kind of animals they use for livestock rearing. At the end of the module, we will also look at changes in this practice over the time and the challenges that are faced by pastoral communities in adjusting to the changing social and environmental conditions of India. Humans have been using natural resources around their environment for living. They require food, water and shelter, and to get that, they have used innovative practices. One of the methods is agriculture. It gave humans control over production of crops and food. Another method is production of animals. Breeding of animals, tending and rearing them are part of pastoralism. These practices are called as natural resource management practices. Domesticated animals have always been part of food of humans. Before this, hunting and gathering communities hunted wild animals. But it was not a sure way of getting food. Instead of this, when humans gained control over breeding of animals, they could keep them as a stored supply of live food. They could also move the animals from one place to another and use them at the time of scarcity. In most cases, agricultural communities used to practice some form of livestock rearing. In some areas, when agriculture became less productive, it was necessary for humans to depend on livestock rearing entirely. In these cases, farmers started to move their livestock to different areas in search of pastures and water. Pastoralism requires a great deal of land which has good production of grass and other fodder species. It is a more reliable method than hunting and gathering to access food. In many areas, pastoralists continue to do farming but on a very small scale. The lands may not be productive enough, there could be drought, or the crops that they grow may not be sufficient for their household use. In this case, they use the lands to grow fodder. That fodder is used for the livestock, and then the animals can be used for food and other tradable products. In many areas, animals are considered as wealth by communities. Many traditional communities are strongly attached to the kind of animals they breed, and there are some cultures or traditions which talk about how these associations originated. Domestication of animals happened very long time back. Domesticated animals are not just tamed animals. In the process of domestication, selective breeding was done by humans to add the kind of characters that are desired for food or for other products. Domestication of cattle happened around 8000 BC, somewhere around southwestern Asia and Indus Valley. Water buffalo is supposed to be domesticated some 5000 years ago in the Indus Valley civilization and Yangtze civilization. By 4000 BC, domestication of major mammals such as sheep, cattle, goat was completed. Many mammals and bird species have been domesticated by humans till now. However, pastoralists use only 20 of them at present. It appears that early pastoralists were agriculturists, farmers who started to take their livestock around for grazing in search of better pasture and water. They had to take advantage of landscape as and when possible. Pastoralists and their animals have a very close relationship. The animals provide products such as milk, meat, wool, in some cases hair. Humans provide protection, care and ensure breeding of the animals. Most of the times, the livestock breeders talk about stories of how they started to herd that animal. In India, some communities have a taboo against slaughtering the animals that they are herding. It is related to some myths or other. These animals are then maintained only for dairy production. The animals that the livestock breeders keep are dependent on what kind of environmental conditions they are living in. The kind of grass that is required, the kind of other fodder species required, and the water that is required decides what animals are going to be kept by the pastoralist. In many cases, the choice is also influenced by tradition. Domesticated animals such as cats, dogs, and poultry are not herded in the way cattle, sheep, or goats are herded. Pastoral animals can be broadly divided into two types: grazing animals and browsing animals. Grazing animals require good quality grass and herbaceous fodder species in the landscape. But for a browsing animal, the landscape also needs to have good quality fodder trees and shrubs. Pastoral communities are very important because they have bred indigenous breeds of cattle in India. The Rabaris and Maldhari communities have maintained Gir and Kankrej breed of cattle. They mainly supplied bullocks to the farmers. India has 27 indigenous breeds of cattle, 40 breeds of sheep, 22 breeds of goats, and 8 breeds of buffaloes. One interesting animal is Mithun. The case of Mithun is very different from other domesticated animals. Mithun is a semi-domesticated animal. It is seen in Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, and Manipur states of Northeast India. Herds of Mithun are considered either privately owned or owned by the entire village community. They are allowed to graze freely into the forest throughout the year. One single person or a group of people go and feed them salt. Only at the time of ceremonies, the Mithun herd is brought back to the village. Mithun is mainly a sacrificial animal. It is part and parcel of the culture of these tribes. They are slaughtered at the time of rituals such as marriage, building of house, and agricultural festivals. In Africa and Middle East, pastoralism was mainly practiced by tribes. These tribes had traditional control over their landscapes and they were exclusively using these landscapes. But in India, the conditions are very different. Pastoralisms and the pastoral communities are integrated into the complex caste system that we see in India. In this, the pastoral communities occupied land side by side of other nomadic communities and the settled cultivators. In the caste system, these groups were endogamous social groups which specialized in animal husbandry. In parts of India, pastures could be used only seasonally. So, there were traditional agreements with other communities which were living in this landscape and they decided how grazing will be practiced in the area. Pastoralism can be divided broadly into 3 categories. The first category of this is nomadic pastoralism. Nomadic pastoralists are distinguished by the fact that they are entirely dependent on animals. They do not practice any kind of agriculture. We know of Changpas in the highlands of Ladakh, which are small communities moving in the most inaccessible of the areas with their animals. The whole community moves together. They take their animals from one pasture to the other pasture as and when the ecological conditions are suitable. These are family groups. They trade animal products with other communities and get the necessities such as food and clothes, etc. A more organized form of pastoralism is known as transhumance or transhuman pastoralism. India has many kinds of ecological conditions. In the higher Himalayas and in the dry parts of India, pastures do not have good grass throughout the year. In the Deccan Peninsula, pasture land will be having green fodder only during the monsoon. In Himalayas, the pastures in the alpine region are available only during the summer period. In this condition, the communities which practice pastoralism have to move from season to season to different pasture areas. In Himalayas, the people, livestock herders, occupy the lowland areas during the winter because at that time the upper region of Himalaya is entirely covered by snow. Only in summer, when the ice melts and the grass becomes available, that these communities move to the upper ranges. In Deccan Peninsular region, in Maharashtra, Dhangars are a specific community of pastoralists. They occupy the dry Deccan Peninsular region. They are settled people, in fact. They have agriculture in many areas, but the agriculture is not productive enough because this is a very dry, drought-prone area. In this case, the Dhangars graze their sheep and goat around their villages during the monsoon when the grasslands are green. However, in the dry period, they have to move towards the Western Ghat in the forested areas, or sometimes they move towards the eastern Maharashtra where dry forests are available for them to graze. Transhuman pastoralism is a very complex form of management practice. The pastoralists who move from one place to another have to know the landscape very well. They have to know where they will find good grasslands, where they will find good water for their animals. In addition to this, they must have strong social bonding with the other settled communities and villages which are there along their way. In most cases, transhuman pastoralists have been moving along the same routes for hundreds of years. They have strong links with the villagers. In fact, there is a strong cultural relationship between the pastoralists and the farmers. When a pastoral community comes to the village, they have to get in touch with the farmer, and the farmer allows them to settle in the fallow fields. The dung that is produced by the sheep is a good fertilizer for the field. At the same time, the pastoral community gets food and fodder for the livestock. In the past, these relationships were based on mutual understanding. Sometimes the farmers would give grains to the Dhangars to allow them to settle in the farms. In recent times, farming has changed drastically. In many areas, irrigation has made it possible to farm throughout the year. Use of fertilizers also increases farming capacity. In this case, the farmers do not require the pastoral animals for fertilizer anymore. Pastoralists find it very hard to find fallow fields in which they can settle down. Pastoral communities normally move with entire families, camels, dogs, all included in the household. In some cases, it's only the young individuals who move out today. Pastoralism in India is also based on cyclic movements from lowland to highland. In the upper ranges of Himalaya, pastoralists used to maintain grasslands for the cattle. These were often considered sacred and were known as bugyals. These bugyals had cultural importance. There are many tribes which rear many different types of animals in the Himalayan region. Bakarwals are the ones which herd goats and sheep. Gaddis, Kinnoras, sheep herding Bhotiyas, yak herding Sherpas are some other community. Gujars used to hunt buffaloes. These communities occupied areas of Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Bhutan, almost up to Arunachal Pradesh. In the past, they freely moved along the international borders, sometimes into Nepal, sometimes into Bhutan. The traditionally maintained pastures required special practices. In some cases, the pastoralists used to put fire to these areas. A certain amount of grazing was constantly required to ensure that the fodder quality remained the same. In the Thar desert area, grazing was available only during the rainy period. This region is so dry and sandy that it has almost no capacity to produce crops throughout the year. The rainfall was low and erratic. In this case, pastoralism was the only alternative for people, and mainly the landless people of the region. The farmers also reverted to pastoralism in the dry period or the drought period. So far, we have looked at how mobile pastoralism is practiced. But there is another type of pastoralism, that of settled farmers. Settled pastoralists have also existed in India for several thousand years. Most of the farmers had to keep some livestock for their own use. The cattle was used for milk, sometimes for transportation, and very often for labor in the farms. These animals were mainly dependent on grazing in the village common lands and the fallow fields. Agricultural residues were used by settled farmers for their own livestock. In settled pastoralism, the livestock returns back to the homestead at night. The grazing was in the past entirely on village common lands. Today, the village common lands are overexploited. In the dry period, farmers had to collect grass either from their own agriculture or from the village pasture and store them for use during the winter. In some communities such as Maldharis and Bharwads, they have settled along urban areas and village peripheries. Today, these communities actually have to buy fodder from other crop residue. But they have become very successful because they have linked with the milk industry. They are also linked with the local mithai walas and halwais because their cattle produces the best of milk. Large-scale commercialized farming of livestock such as sheep, goat and cattle is seen in other countries. In United States of America and Australia, cattle ranches and sheep stations are very common. These are mainly maintained for meat production in large quantities. This is also settled pastoralism. But in India, we do not have such large-scale commercial farming of animals. Our animals are mostly kept in small scale by farmers and other landless people. They are mainly as a supplementary to other agricultural activities and other livelihood activities. Ducks are kept by some people in Kerala and West Bengal. Poultry is kept in backyard of most small households. Milk and meat are the two main products of pastoralists. They are very important because they provide nutrition to all. Sale of meat of cattle and camels is a taboo in our country. It is also illegal in many areas. However, in other parts of the world, meat and even blood are major products of livestock. They are highly important for pastoral communities. Another very important product of livestock is dung. Dung is a very important fuel source in rural India. It is also used for construction of houses, walls and other structure. Dung serves as a basic fertilizer and helps maintain productivity of the farmlands. Milk is an important product which was consumed as well as traded by pastoralists. Milk from cows and buffaloes was the basic product, But there could be many other products which were milk-based. Buttermilk, curd, paneer, cheese and ghee are products which are in high demand from the rest of the society. Churpi is a cheese which is derived from yak milk. It is a highly important source of food in the Himalayan regions of Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim. Another important product from the livestock is wool. Wool was used for manufacture of many items. Pashmina shawls are made of wood obtained from 4 distinct breeds of Kashmir goats. They are expensive and in high demand by tourists visiting India. Pastoral communities also engaged in the trade of handicraft such as blankets made of animal hair, leather items, caps and many other products. In pastoralism, care needs to be taken that pastures continue to have productivity, because if the quality of fodder is reduced, the animals have to suffer. Carrying capacity of a pasture is a major important issue. How many animals can easily graze on a pasture needs to be determined constantly. The carrying capacity depends on ecological conditions and also on the kind of animals that are kept by livestock herders. Traditional pastoral communities knew very well that they have to be careful about maintaining the pastures. Many groups moved from place to place. They knew the kind of grasses that grew and could identify the ecological succession in the area, which helped them to determine whether to continue to be in the same pasture or move to some other lands. Traditional arrangement between different pastoral communities helped to maintain the quality of the grasslands. It prevented overexploitation. The decisions did not rest with one individual, they were made by the entire community for the good of the entire community. The availability of pasture controlled animal population, and the availability of animal population controlled the human by limiting the food supply. Most transhuman groups had experienced people who made these decisions. The settled villagers also were very important to the pastoral communities because their cattle also had to graze on there. In recent times, these traditional agreements have become very weak. There is a pressure on pasture as well as water resources, and therefore we see increasing conflicts happening between pastoralists and other cultivators. We have seen how pastoralism evolved in certain environmental and social conditions. Today these conditions are changing, and therefore pastoralists face different kinds of challenges. One of the first challenges is the change of the climate itself. The movement of people from summer to winter, from monsoon to dry season, is today not reliable enough because the rainfall is become very erratic. The village common lands are used for many other purposes. In some areas, industries have grown on the common lands. In some areas, the common lands were taken up by the forest department by creating national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. These lands were the main source of fodder for the pastoralists. Where do they go now? In many cases, they have to force entry into the protected areas, thus leading to conflict with the forest department. Mobile pastoralists face many challenges due to changing social situations. Today, the entire focus of development is on settling of people. Facilities are available to settled people which cannot ever be made available to people who continue to move from one place to another. In mobile communities, the children suffer when they are traveling with their parents. They do not have access to education or health care. The women of the transhuman pastoral households suffer a lot. They have to live in the open, have no access to sanitation or healthcare, and therefore are very strongly affected by this movement from one place to another. There are also safety concerns in all the areas. In 1990s, India had White Revolution. This was a period in which National Dairy Development Board and many other organizations promoted keeping of livestock and milk products were harvested. It was a very successful venture. Many communities, including the landless and non-pastoral communities, started to get livestock from the government programs. But at the same time, there should have been attention given to the pasture improvement, which was not done. So we have a case where livestock is increasing in some areas, but at the same time, the fodder availability and water availability is going down. Conflicts are a constant fact of life for pastoralists today. In many areas, grazing by sheep or cattle was considered detrimental to the ecosystem. Many environmentalists spoke against grazing. Government programs of watershed management and forest protection discouraged grazing. They fined the grazers. In some areas, village panchayats restricted grazing of livestock in the village land itself. This affected the livestock keeping community to a large extent. They had no access to agricultural residues because they did not have any land. They were left destitute in many cases. In parts of Western Ghat today, the previous Gauri Dhangar communities who used to own hundreds of cattle today have just 2 or 3 animals because they cannot have grazing in the forest area. Their whole livelihoods are changing today from pastoral to some other non-pastoral livelihoods. Raikas are camel breeders of Rajasthan. They used to breed high-quality camels and were known for that. Camels were mainly used for transport. But today there are many other forms of transportation available and there is no demand for camels. As a result, the livelihoods of this community is changing. Another program of government for improvement of livestock was making life difficult for indigenous breeders. The program was for artificial insemination and creation of crossbred varieties of cattle, sheep and goat. In such conditions, the indigenous cattle breeders had to allow insemination by foreign breeds. This weakened the important disease resistance in the cattle. It also changed the production of milk and meat in these animals. In some areas, exotic varieties of sheep were brought in. Today we have realized the importance of indigenous breeds of cattle. In many areas, there are now germplasm banks established to collect indigenous breeds and to save them for future generations. These indigenous breeds are entirely created by the pastoralists from the past. We must respect the kind of help that they have given to the entire society. In this module, we looked at pastoralism, which is an important practice of natural resource management in India. We looked at the kind of pastoral communities that exist in India and the changes that are happening in their practices today. We also looked at challenges which are faced by these communities at present. Social, environmental, and legal restrictions often discourage pastoral practices in India today. We need to understand that pastoralism is a very important practice and gives direct access to food for many landless and poor communities. We must make out measures to improve the quality of pastures and also to improve the livelihoods of the people who have tended indigenous breed for many centuries. I hope that you have learned a little bit about pastoralism by watching this video. For further reading, you can refer to our reference section in which there are books and articles about pastoral communities in India. You can also look at the e-text which is already available along with this lecture. Thank you so much and look forward to seeing you again.